who has come to open Sean's show. Yeah. So I'll pass you over to Michael.
Thanks, Gary. Well, it's a great honour actually to be here to have a chance to talk about these fantastic works of art and to open the exhibition. For me, it's a pretty special occasion. Back in 2005, Sean produced a work of art which was in 14 panels, some large, some small, and they toured to Dubai and then to Florence, where the Italians absolutely loved them. And then they came back here and I acquired them and put them in Wallcliffe House. And of course, 2 years ago they disappeared. So it's both a poignant sort of occasion for me, but also an exciting one because we're surrounded by fabulous works of art. Actually, I've managed to acquire one to sort of half replace what I lost. But really beautiful works of landscape art. Landscape art has always had a very central role in Australian painting. And it's easy for us to assume that that's been the case the world over. But in fact, it hasn't. Landscape art landscape painting is a quite recent phenomenon in the world of Western art. The Romans and the Greeks were doing a bit of it, and the Chinese, as usual, way ahead of the Western world, were painting what we'd call pure landscapes in the 10th and 11th century. But in the Western world, it wasn't until the 19th century that landscape art actually came into its own. The Dutch had a bit of a dabble in the 16th because they broke away from the Spanish and they wanted something more than religious paintings to stick on their walls, so they celebrated that with some landscapes. But in the really important academies in Italy and France, landscape painting was considered an inferior form of art. What they favoured really was history painting, religious painting, allegorical painting, and classical painting, and symbolic sort of painting. And in fact, it's interesting to think back on those times pre the 19th century where the worship of nature was considered a mortal sin. Very different today, I might say. But beginning in the 19th century, landscape art started to come into its own. And there were some academics and some scholars who wrote about the importance of nature. The Industrial Revolution had occurred, and I guess that made people start to think, well, nature actually is quite beautiful and worth representing. But even John Constable, the famous English landscape artist in the early 19th century, had trouble selling his paintings. They were frowned upon really by the academies, and it wasn't until about 1830 that he was admitted to the Academy in London. And from there on, along with the scholarly sort of papers and books that were written, landscape art started to come into its own. And that paved the way really for the plein air painters and the impressionists that we all love so much, and onwards into the 20th century. It's not surprising, therefore, that landscape art has had such a core place in Australian painting, because Australia was settled in the early 19th century, effectively, and the early artists in Bouvalot and Glover and Von Gerard and so on, trying to represent the Australian landscape, were mirroring what was happening around the world at the time, where landscape painting was coming into its own. And they again laid the foundations then for the Australian Impressionists, you know, Roberts and Street and so on. And during the 20th century, notwithstanding all the social realism and abstract expressionism and all that other stuff, there were always really important landscape artists, you know, the Fred Williams and so on. And that's the context I think we need to view Sean's paintings in. These, in my view, are in a very important part of the genesis and the development of landscape art in Australia. Sean is a unique artist, and he has a unique way of representing the landscape around here that we all know and love so well, and of representing it in its various moods, and sort of the solitude and the silence that exists around here in different parts, and the sort of atmosphere that exists. Constable made the comment once, painting is but another way of imagining and of seeing, and that's what we see around us here today. One of the greatest landscape artists of all time, of course, was Turner. And Turner was notable not just for the landscape that he painted, but the way he represented light and atmosphere and the weather and so on. In fact, if you look at Turner's paintings, they're more about that than the landscape itself. And that's, I think, what you have to compare Sean's paintings with. They are very atmospheric, and they represent the weather and the environment that we see here in Margaret River in all its different forms. This is a fantastic exhibition, with variety not only in the scale of the works, but in the nature of them and what they're representing. One of Sean's skills, I think, is to explore the effect of light on and of shadow on the landscape. And so even if you look at the painting over here, which is pretty well masked by the people, but if you look at the shadow, the darker areas and that, they contain a tremendous amount of detail. And this painting here actually is quite similar to some of the paintings in the 14 that I lost. As Sean's moved on, if you go to the other side of that partition, you'll find the foreground, the darker areas have more detail. And instead of the river, there's a road. Sean says, we all spend so much time on the road, and here's a road going through a landscape, and the landscape has a lot of detail. But there's always this interplay between light. Similar. And I noticed that at different times of day it was totally different. It was not static but dynamic. So that at one time of day the sky was dark and the clouds were light, and at another time of day the sky was light and the clouds were dark. And so these are fantastic sort of living works. And the weather, of course, is something that everyone down here takes really seriously. I don't know if it's because so many activities depend on it, whether you're surfing or you're growing grapes and producing wine. The weather is absolutely fundamental, and all of us here have experienced the weather and the atmospheric conditions that you see in these paintings at different times. So I think they're a fabulous collection. They evoke, for those of us who are lucky enough to either live here or spend long periods of time down here in Margaret River, they evoke the uniqueness of the place. They evoke the feeling that you get here of contentment and of well-being, and the wonder that I think Margaret River gives you about nature and all that it has to offer. So, Sean, well done. I'm delighted to open this exhibition.
Thanks, Michael. What a great narrative on art history and Sean's work.